Hey, what's up, everyone? I played a game of chess earlier this week, which I think had some pretty instructional moments in the opening as well as sort of in the end game. So just wanted to show it to you here. Let's dive in. So I played this on chess.com, a bit of a higher rated opponent than me. I was playing with the black pieces and I played the Caro-Kann. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll not be surprised by that. And they played this interesting move, d3, which is called the Breyer variation or Breyer variation, which I don't play against very much. I guess sort of the I don't know, mainline way to play against it is of course you push the d pawn, and when they bring the knight either to c3 or to d2, playing e5 is actually quite strong because you can then potentially push this pawn. Since this knight isn't out already, you can kind of get some nice dark squared control in the center. But I didn't do that. I just played kind of according to sort of how I would typically play a setup like this when this pawn can be captured. I captured, the knight came out, I brought out my knight, and then they captured and I took here. So this actually ends up looking a lot like a variation called the Tartakower Variation, which I am generally quite comfortable with. The only real difference is that white's pawn is here instead of here, which I felt like is probably better for me. And just to understand kind of how the rest of this game went, I just want to switch over to this board here and show you a bit of the Tartakower Variation. It looks like this, very similar to the game, except again that this pawn is pushed to d4 instead of d3. We take there, I bring the knight, and we take here. And now some of the ideas are, first of all, I'm going to bring out this bishop so that I can castle right here, and it's going to be lined up against the king side and against the h pawn there. I castle and then immediately take the e-file with this rook. And part of the reason for that is because next I'm actually going to put my knight on f8, which is, it seems like a little bit of a strange or not very active square for my knight. But the reason is often white will open up these light squares, this light square diagonal, and line something up against my h-pawn. And actually having the knight on f8 is very useful defending that h-pawn. And then the knight can potentially come up here and join in a kingside attack, which is kind of the next main idea. I typically bring out the bishop, sometimes out here to kind of tempt white to push h3, and then bring it back. And then the idea is I want to line up my queen and bishop against the h pawn and actually sacrifice my bishop on h3. And after sacrificing the bishop for two pawns, this is basically a really nice position with a really good attack. So I have the dark squared bishop as part of the attack. Maybe at some point I can like double up the rooks and then bring one of my rooks into the attack. This knight can maybe come in at some point as well, and the king is pretty opened up, and I have lots of good potential for attack. So this is kind of the dream position for the Tartakower Variation. So in this game, I was going for something similar. So I brought out my bishop, just like we saw. I castled, I took the e-file, and you can see that white isn't playing the exact same moves as in the example I just showed. They're actually going to fianchetto this dark squared bishop, which they do. I bring my knight to f8 anyway, which is probably actually not necessary. It's not a bad move, but there really isn't much need to actually defend this pawn because white's pawns are on light squares over here. So the queen and the bishop are not actually going to get lined up against my h-pawn the way that they often would. So maybe the knight actually would have been a bit more useful here and potentially able to come to one of these two squares. But anyway, it's all right. This is no problem. Now after knight d2, I just make sort of this quick little threat against the h-pawn. And again, I'm kind of hoping for this h3 move so I can maybe sacrifice my light squared bishop over here. So I play e6. And now this is where things started to get a little bit funny. They brought their knight out here, and of course now they can trade off their knight for my dark squared bishop. And this gives white the bishop pair, which I feel like at this stage in my chess journey, I need to stop underestimating how powerful the bishop pair is, because this is actually exactly what happened. I decided instead of defending, or instead of moving this bishop somewhere and saving it, I brought my rook so that I could sort of feel like my rook was a little bit more active after this trade. But again, this gives white the bishop pair. Someone was just calling my phone. I had to had to cancel that. So this gives white the bishop pair, and it actually becomes quite powerful. A better move back here actually would have been to put the bishop on e5, and the reason is now white can still trade off for that bishop, but they have to trade their own dark squared bishop for mine, and so it ends up being a little more even. I can either sort of activate my queen here, or I can fix my pawn structure and maybe start to put more pawns on dark squares since I don't have a dark squared bishop anymore. But instead I played this rook move, brought my rook up, kind of thinking that it looked a little more active. And then I did the thing where I lined up my bishop and my queen against this pawn. Unfortunately, although I seemed to get this kind of position that I wanted and I captured this pawn, it was absolutely a blunder. And there are a few reasons why this was actually a big issue. You know, in the example that I showed you back here, this is typically a really good move, but there are some really key reasons why in this position it's a blunder. So the first issue is after the trade happens, or after the sacrifice happens, now white not only has the bishop pair, but I have no bishops. They have a bishop pair against a knight and two extra pawns. And, you know, because of this kind of setup with the knight on f8, the knight isn't even very active. And so that's a bit of an issue. I also, a key part of this kingside attack in the normal sort of Tartakower variation is having a dark squared bishop right here that is actually helping with this attack right away. So there's immediately some checkmate threats here. In this case, of course, that dark squared bishop was traded off, and so I don't actually have it. And then the other thing is, after white comes back here with the bishop, my attack is pretty much done. I was thinking that maybe I can, you know, bring some of my rooks in, bring my knight in, but look how powerful these bishops are from white. They are controlling the entire center of the board. There is no way for either of my rooks to get in. Like, maybe I can try to double them up and do something on the e-file, but those bishops are just way too powerful. And so that's really, I guess, the first sort of instructional thing about this game. The first kind of lesson that I learned is, you know, there are these ideas in openings that often work, but sometimes they don't. And especially when it's an idea like this, where you're actually sacrificing something like a bishop or a knight for a couple of pawns, you need to be pretty sure that it's going to work, because if it doesn't, then you're just left in a very bad position. And I think the other thing to learn is just like, I really need to stop underestimating the bishop pair. Like, I feel like this has burned me a few times. But anyway, so this is what happened. And at this point, things are looking pretty grim, and there's not a lot that I can do. According to the engine, it's like +2.5, +2.6, something along those lines. But there was another really interesting sort of instructional moment in the endgame that I'd like to show you. So we kind of continued along for a bit. I tried to double up my rooks. I tried to bring out my knight. We traded a few pieces. Again, these bishops just like harassing my rook and pushing it around. And then white started trying to trade the queens, which I tried to decline a queen trade because I'm down material, so I don't want them to just trade down and simplify into an endgame that should be winning for them. And now at this point, I actually, so it's worth noting back here that I don't have a lot of options for declining the trade because my rook is also hanging. So I brought the queen here to defend the rook, thinking like if the pawns start trying to chase the queen, then maybe I have to kind of sneak around here. Of course, I can't go there because of the bishop, but you know, maybe I can keep my queen defending this rook somehow. But white just simply offered another trade, and I actually thought that I had to accept, and I did, because I thought that this was checkmate. Turns out, analyzing the game afterward, of course it's not, because the knight can just drop back to f8. It's still a pretty sad position, but at least queen c8 is not checkmate. But I traded queens, And yeah, things are looking pretty bad at this point. Sort of my only hope here is if I can get these 2 extra pawns kind of rolling down the board and trying to cause problems with one of them being close to promotion, and trying to get this rook a little bit more active despite the really powerful bishops. So I'm going to skip a bunch of this. We sort of maneuvered around. They ended up being able to centralize their king a little bit. I tried to bring my king out, trying to keep it so that there isn't any sort of infiltration with this rook as well, which I thought was important. Get some pawns rolling down the board. And around here, this is just interesting. I moved the rook back over here because I wanted to get it out of the way of getting these pawns down the board. But look at these bishops, just completely harassing the rook and forcing it to go back over to the edge. So now, of course, white's still trying to trade and simplify down. And this is the moment that I think is actually quite instructional. I made a poor decision here. After white captured with the bishop, I decided to recapture with the pawn. The reason I decided to recapture with the pawn is I felt like having this outside passed pawn with a rook behind it would be powerful, would have some potential, what's the word I'm looking for? Some potential, basically, for causing some problems to white in the future. The downside, of course, is that my pawn structure on this side of the board is now absolutely terrible. I have 2 doubled isolated pawn islands. I have no pawns on the G file at all. And I think what's instructional about this game is it kind of shows exactly why that is such a bad situation for me to be in. So I start trying to push this pawn down the board, but of course, it's easily blockaded. Moving the bishop back would have worked as well. And now the problem is, like, there's nothing left for me to do. Like, how am I ever going to get rid of that rook? Or how am I ever going to do anything with these pawns? Like, my pawns are basically completely frozen. And so I kind of try some things, like hit the bishop around, try to add some empty threat to white's f pawn, but of course it's easily defended. Try to bring my king. White made a pass pawn in the middle of the board. Not having much else to do, I pushed that pawn like one step closer to promotion. Blockade this one, but now my king kind of has to always be kind of babysitting this pawn, right? And then at this point, white has some freedom. Like they can remove their blockade of this pawn, but this square is still being very well protected by their pieces. And there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do with these pawns. There's nothing I can do with these pawns. And so, I try some things. I felt like maybe this pin would be helpful for some reason, but of course it's easily removed. I tried to push that pawn down the board and then just ended up getting my rook trapped, traded it off, at least grabbed this pawn, but now the game is over. I'm going to lose all of these pawns. And then I thought, maybe there was some like desperado chance that I could get rid of these and get one of these pawns down the board, but the rook is just too fast. It gobbles all of these pawns and white's f pawn is pushed. So yeah, it's not really worth showing the rest of it, but you can see like it just happens how I said, like the pawns get gobbled up. I try to push something, but I'm not quick enough, and I just simply get there was actually like a checkmated 2 here, I think, if the queen goes up here, but white just sacrificed the rook and I resigned here because if I take it, then it's just king and queen versus queen, and that's easily winning for white. So it was interesting because I felt like there were these kind of 3 main instructional moments that I really found helpful. One was way back here in the opening. Again, not underestimating the bishop pair. And I underestimated the bishop pair on this move, thinking that this would be fine if I lose my dark squared bishop. And then later, that was also part of the problem with sacrificing the other bishop. But yeah, like just the idea that here, when this bishop is being threatened, even just this simple move of bishop e5, allowing my bishop to be traded, but having it traded for a bishop instead of a knight would have been quite a lot better. And it's something for me to keep in mind in these sorts of positions in the future. Of course, in this position, as I mentioned, this sacrifice did not work, and it's one of those places where just because it can often work in this opening doesn't mean that it's going to work in this exact position, and you have to be pretty careful about it. And again, having two bishops against no bishops, and with me being down material and having a pretty inactive knight and having a hard time getting the rooks out and having all of the center squares covered by white's bishops, meant that really sacrificing my light squared bishop was not a good idea. And then finally, just this interesting idea in the end game. If I had taken with the rook instead, then this is still bad for black. Yeah, still quite bad for black. Like the game is probably still lost. The engine is giving it like pretty much +3 for white, but when I capture with this, now it's like +4.5. So it's much worse that way. So even though, you know, the game is probably lost either way, at least this way, my pawn structure is such that I might be able to cause some problems by getting some pawns rolling down the board, having pawns defending each other and connected. Whereas in this case, with what I actually did, having no pawns on the G file and this pawn like very, very easily blockaded by white's pieces, it was not a good trade-off. Like I knew that this was going to be a bad pawn structure, but I felt like having the rook behind the pawn and having it only a few squares away from promotion could be an asset. And I guess maybe it was a bit of an asset, but not enough to counteract the terrible pawn structure and the fact that white could blockade and then just completely freeze my pawns and there would be nothing left for me to do. So it was a pretty interesting game. I hope you learned something from it. I certainly did learn a few things. And yeah, thank you for watching. And there will be more games like this coming up. See you next time.